May 21, 1942. The convoy formed up in the cold waters off Iceland. 35 merchant ships arranged in columns, their holds packed with tanks and aircraft and ammunition that Joseph Stalin had been demanding for months. The escorts took their positions around the formation, destroyers and corvettes and armed trawlers, their crews knowing what lay ahead. The route to Murmansk would take them past German-occupied Norway, through waters patrolled by U-boats and within range of Luftwaffe bombers, along a coast where German surface raiders waited for exactly this kind of target. Every man aboard knew the odds. 3 weeks earlier, Convoy PQ-15 had lost 3 ships. The convoy before that had lost 5. But the Soviet Union was bleeding, losing thousands of soldiers every day, and these ships carried the weapons that might keep the Eastern Front from collapsing entirely. The merchantmen were a mix of British, American, and Panamanian registry, but the cargo was primarily American, part of the Lend-Lease program that President Roosevelt had promised would turn the United States into the arsenal of democracy. In the holds of these 35 ships sat 147 tanks, 77 aircraft, 770 vehicles, and thousands of tons of ammunition, spare parts, raw materials, and food. Stalin had been asking for a second front in Europe, a massive Allied invasion that would draw German forces away from the Soviet Union. Instead, he was getting these convoys, these dangerous voyages through Arctic waters that delivered supplies at enormous cost. He had made his displeasure clear in message after message to Churchill and Roosevelt. But he also knew, though he would never say it publicly, that without these supplies, his armies might not survive the summer. The convoy sailed north, following the ice edge, moving into the perpetual daylight of the Arctic summer where there would be no darkness to hide them. The temperature dropped. Ice formed on the rigging and decks. The sea was gray and hostile, the sky a lighter shade of the same gray, the two merging at a horizon that seemed impossibly distant. The merchant crews, many of them civilian sailors, stood watches in weather that could kill a man in minutes if he went overboard. They wore layer upon layer of clothing, but the cold still found its way through. Their ships were slow, vulnerable, designed for cargo, not combat. Their only protection was the escorts around them and the hope that they might somehow reach Soviet waters before the Germans found them. The Germans found them on May 25th. The first attack came from the air, Junkers Ju-88 bombers flying low over the water, their crews having spotted the convoy from bases in northern Norway. The escorts threw up anti-aircraft fire, tracers arcing across the sky, but the bombers pressed their attacks. The merchant ship Syros took a bomb in her engine room and began to sink. Her crew abandoned ship, climbing into lifeboats in water so cold it would kill them in 15 minutes if they weren't picked up. A destroyer raced to rescue them, her crew hauling half-frozen men aboard while watching the sky for more bombers. The Syros slipped beneath the surface, taking her cargo of tanks and ammunition with her. 34 ships remained. The attacks continued. The Germans had realized this was a major convoy, worth concentrating forces against. More bombers came and U-boats began to gather. On May 26th, the freighter Alomar took a torpedo amidships and broke in half, sinking in less than 3 minutes. Most of her crew went down with her. The convoy kept moving, the remaining ships closing ranks, trying to maintain formation while dodging attacks. The escorts raced back and forth, dropping depth charges on suspected U-boat contacts, firing at aircraft, pulling survivors from the water when they could. The sea around the convoy was littered with wreckage and oil slicks, and the bodies of men who hadn't made it to the lifeboats. On May 27th, the attacks intensified. The Germans threw everything they had at the convoy, determined to destroy it before it reached Soviet waters. Bombers came in waves, and U-boats pressed attacks despite the escort's depth charges. The American freighter Carleton was hit by a torpedo and began to settle by the stern, her crew abandoning ship in good order, their training taking over despite the terror. The British ship Empire Lawrence took a bomb on her foredeck and caught fire, flames spreading through her cargo holds. Her crew fought the fire for 2 hours before abandoning her, watching from their lifeboats as she burned down to the waterline. The Soviet tanker Stary Bolshevik, carrying high-octane aviation fuel, took a torpedo and exploded in a fireball that could be seen for miles. There were no survivors. 30 ships remained, still steaming east, still carrying their cargo toward Murmansk. The convoy commander considered turning back, but the orders were clear: deliver the supplies. The Soviet Union needed these tanks and aircraft. Stalin needed them. The convoy pressed on. The attacks began to slacken on May 28th as the convoy moved into waters where Soviet aircraft could provide some cover. Fighters from Murmansk, many of them American-made P-39 Era Cobras delivered by earlier convoys, flew patrol over the ships. The German bombers became more cautious, less willing to press their attacks. The U-boats fell back, unwilling to operate so close to Soviet bases. The convoy had survived the worst of it. 28 merchant ships, carrying the bulk of the original cargo, approached the entrance to the Kola Inlet on May 30th. The port of Murmansk was a wreck. German bombers had been pounding it for months, turning the city into a landscape of rubble and burned-out buildings. The harbor facilities were primitive even before the bombing, just wooden wharves and a few cranes, completely inadequate for handling the volume of cargo the convoys were bringing. But it was the only ice-free port in the Soviet Arctic, the only place where ships could unload year-round, and so the convoys kept coming. The merchant ships tied up at the wharves, and Soviet dock workers swarmed aboard. Many of these workers were political prisoners, men and women sent to labor camps in the Arctic, now pressed into service, unloading the vital supplies. They worked in shifts around the clock, hauling crates and driving tanks off the ships, stacking supplies on the docks under the supervision of NKVD guards. The work was brutal, the conditions harsh, but the cargo was desperately needed. Every tank, every aircraft, every truck and crate of ammunition would go straight to the front, to units that had been fighting with obsolete equipment or no equipment at all. Soviet officials inspected the cargo, checking manifests, counting tanks and aircraft. They were thorough, suspicious, making sure they received everything that had been promised. The American and British liaison officers who had accompanied the convoy watched this inspection with a mix of frustration and understanding. They knew the Soviets were fighting for their survival, knew the desperation that drove this meticulous accounting. But they also knew that back in Britain and America, workers had built these tanks and aircraft, sailors had died delivering them, and the Soviet response would likely be a complaint that it wasn't enough. The news of the convoy's arrival traveled up the chain of command. Port officials reported to regional commanders. Regional commanders reported to Moscow. The reports detailed the cargo: 147 tanks, 77 aircraft, 770 vehicles, thousands of tons of other supplies. They noted the losses. 7 ships sunk, hundreds of men killed, but the bulk of the cargo delivered. They provided the information Joseph Stalin had been waiting for, the confirmation that this convoy, designated PQ-16, had made it through. Stalin received the report in the Kremlin, in the small office where he spent most of his time during the war, chain-smoking cigarettes and studying maps and casualty reports. He was 53 years old, his hair graying, his face showing the strain of the previous year. Since the German invasion in June 1941, the Soviet Union had suffered catastrophic losses, millions of soldiers killed or captured, vast territories occupied, major cities under siege, the industrial heartland of Ukraine lost. The Germans were pushing toward the Caucasus oil fields, toward Stalingrad, toward objectives that, if taken, would cripple the Soviet war effort. Every day brought new reports of disasters, new demands for reinforcements and equipment that didn't exist. The Lend-Lease supplies were keeping the Soviet military alive. American trucks were hauling Soviet artillery and ammunition, American Aircraft were flying combat missions. American tanks were equipping Soviet armored units. American food was feeding Soviet soldiers. The aid was substantial, growing larger with each convoy, but it was never enough. It would never be enough, not while the Germans were destroying Soviet armies faster than they could be rebuilt. Stalin read the report about PQ-16's arrival. 147 tanks, 77 aircraft, 770 vehicles. He did the math in his head, comparing these numbers to his losses. The Soviet Union was losing hundreds of tanks every week in combat. These 147 tanks, delivered at such cost, would equip perhaps 3 tank brigades. Those brigades would go into action, and within days or weeks, most of those tanks would be destroyed. The 77 aircraft would replace perhaps a week's worth of losses. The vehicles would help, the trucks especially, but the need was so much greater than what was arriving. He put down the report and lit another cigarette. His reaction, as recorded by those who worked closest to him during this period, was not gratitude but calculation. The supplies were useful, certainly. They were necessary. But they were not sufficient. What he needed, what he had been demanding in message after message to Churchill and Roosevelt, was a second front. He needed the British and Americans to invade France, to force Hitler to divert 40 or 50 divisions away from the Eastern Front. That would make a real difference. These convoys, these dangerous voyages that the British and Americans kept pointing to as proof of their commitment, were a poor substitute for actual military action in the West. His response to the convoy's arrival was reportedly brief and dismissive. According to accounts from Soviet officials who were present, he acknowledged the delivery with a curt nod and immediately began discussing the next convoy, asking when it would arrive and what it would carry. There was no expression of thanks for the sailors who had died getting the supplies through. No acknowledgement of the danger the convoys faced. Just the perpetual demand for more, the insistence that the Allies were not doing enough. This was Stalin's pattern throughout the war. Publicly, Soviet propaganda praised the Allied aid, called it a symbol of international solidarity against fascism. Soviet newspapers ran stories about the convoys, about the brave sailors who faced German attacks to deliver supplies. But privately, in the Kremlin, Stalin treated the aid as both insufficient and overdue. He saw it as the minimum the Allies should be doing, not as a generous gesture requiring gratitude. His attitude was that the Soviet Union was bearing the brunt of the war against Germany, that Soviet soldiers were dying in their millions while the British and Americans sat safely behind their ocean barriers, and that sending supplies was the least they could do. There's a story, possibly apocryphal, but consistent with Stalin's character, about his reaction to seeing the manifest for one of the early major convoys. An aide brought him the list of supplies that had arrived, pointing out the quantities of tanks and aircraft and vehicles. Stalin looked at the list, then looked at the casualty reports from the front, then said something to the effect of, "Tell them to send more." Not "thank them." Not "this will help." Just "send more." The aide reportedly tried to explain the difficulties of the Arctic route, the losses the convoys were suffering, the fact that the British and Americans were doing their best. Stalin cut him off. "Tell them to send more," he repeated, "and tell them we need a second front." This attitude created enormous tension in the alliance. British and American officials who dealt with Stalin found him ungrateful to the point of insulting. Averell Harriman, the American ambassador to the Soviet Union, would later describe Stalin as the most difficult negotiating partner he had ever encountered. A man who treated every Allied concession as inadequate and every Allied request as unreasonable. Winston Churchill, after meeting with Stalin in Moscow in August 1942, came away both impressed by Stalin's determination and frustrated by his refusal to acknowledge what the convoys were costing. But there was a deeper truth beneath Stalin's public attitude, something he would never admit during the war but would acknowledge years later. The Soviet Union genuinely needed the Lend-Lease supplies. Without them, the Red Army might not have survived 1942. The American trucks were particularly vital, providing mobility that Soviet industry couldn't match. The aircraft helped maintain air cover over Soviet forces. The tanks, while often inferior to Soviet designs, filled gaps in Soviet production. The food kept Soviet soldiers fed when Soviet agriculture was disrupted by occupation and mobilization. The raw materials, the aluminum and copper and steel, kept Soviet factories running. Stalin knew this. He understood the arithmetic of industrial war, understood that the Soviet Union alone could not outproduce Germany. He needed the American industrial base, needed the supplies that only the United States could provide in sufficient quantity, but acknowledging this publicly would weaken his position. It would suggest the Soviet Union was dependent on the capitalist powers, that the communist system couldn't stand alone against fascism. So he maintained the public pose of dismissiveness, of treating the aid as inadequate, while privately making sure his military commanders integrated the supplies as quickly as possible into Soviet operations. The tanks from PQ-16 went to the front within days of being unloaded. Soviet crews trained on them briefly, learning the controls and weapons, then drove them into combat. Many of these tanks were destroyed in their first battles, knocked out by German anti-tank guns or panzers. But some survived, and those that survived fought again, and gradually Soviet tactics improved, and the tanks that arrived on subsequent convoys had better crews and better support. The aircraft from PQ-16 flew combat missions over the Murmansk area, protecting the port and the convoys that continued to arrive. The trucks hauled ammunition and supplies to Soviet units all across the northern front. The supplies made a difference, even if Stalin wouldn't say so. The convoy losses haunted the Allied planners. 7 ships sunk out of 35 meant a loss rate of 20%. That was sustainable, barely, but just barely. If the losses got much worse, the convoys would become prohibitively expensive. The disaster of convoy PQ-17, which sailed in July 1942 and lost 24 out of 36 ships, would force a temporary suspension of the Arctic convoys. But they would resume, because Stalin kept demanding supplies and because Roosevelt and Churchill had committed to supporting the Soviet Union. The convoys would continue throughout the war, delivering thousands of tanks and aircraft and vehicles, keeping the Red Army supplied through the darkest days and into the eventual victory. Stalin's public comments about Lend-Lease during the war were carefully calibrated. In speeches and statements, he would acknowledge Allied assistance in vague terms, praising the anti-Hitler coalition and the cooperation of freedom-loving peoples. But he never dwelled on the specifics, never detailed how much was arriving or how vital it was. That would have undermined his narrative of Soviet self-reliance, of the Red Army winning through its own strength and sacrifice. The propaganda emphasized Soviet heroism, Soviet production, Soviet victories. The Allied supplies were mentioned but never emphasized. It was only after the war, in private conversations, that Stalin would admit the truth. Nikita Khrushchev, who would later lead the Soviet Union, recorded a conversation with Stalin in which the old dictator reflected on the war. According to Khrushchev, Stalin said, "If we had had to fight Nazi Germany one-on-one, we could not have coped, we would have lost the war." He went on to acknowledge the vital role of American supplies, saying that without Lend-Lease, without the trucks and aircraft and raw materials, the Soviet Union would have been defeated. This admission, made in private years after the war ended, was the closest Stalin ever came to expressing gratitude for the convoys. But in May 1942, as the cargo from PQ-16 was being unloaded at Murmansk, there was no gratitude. There was only the calculation of how long these supplies would last, how many more convoys would be needed, how many more months or years the Soviet Union would have to endure before victory came. Stalin looked at the numbers, did the math, and found them insufficient. His response to the convoy's arrival was not celebration, but renewed demands for more supplies, for a second front, for greater Allied commitment to the war. The sailors who had delivered the cargo never knew about Stalin's reaction, and perhaps that was for the best. They had done their job, had faced German attacks and Arctic weather, and had gotten the supplies through. 28 ships had made it to Murmansk, carrying cargo that would help Soviet soldiers fight and survive. That was what mattered, not whether Joseph Stalin expressed thanks. The convoy crews would sail back to Britain, would rest briefly, and would then sail again, carrying more supplies to the Soviet Union, continuing the dangerous work of keeping the alliance supplied. The Arctic Convoys would continue for the rest of the war, delivering more than 4 million tons of supplies to the Soviet Union. American tanks and aircraft and trucks would become a common sight on the Eastern Front. Soviet soldiers would eat American food, wear American boots, drive American vehicles. The Lend-Lease program would prove vital to Soviet survival and eventual victory. But Stalin would never publicly acknowledge this during the war, would never express the gratitude that the sacrifice of the convoy crews deserved. His reaction to that first major American convoy arrival, to the news that PQ-16 had delivered its cargo despite heavy losses, was characteristic of the man and his approach to the alliance. He took what was offered, demanded more, and gave nothing in return except the continuation of the Soviet war effort. It was a cold calculation, a ruthless assessment of what was needed and what was being provided. There was no room for sentiment, no space for gratitude. There was only the war, the endless grinding war, and the question of whether the Soviet Union would survive it. The tanks from that convoy would fight in the battles around Leningrad, in the desperate defense of the Caucasus, in the brutal street fighting in Stalingrad. The aircraft would fly missions over the Arctic, over the Central Front, over the approaches to Moscow. The trucks would haul supplies across thousands of miles of Soviet territory, keeping armies mobile and supplied. The cargo that had cost 7 ships and hundreds of lives to deliver would be used up in weeks or months of combat, consumed by the insatiable demands of industrial war. And Stalin would continue to demand more, would continue to treat each convoy's arrival not as a gift, but as an installment payment on a debt he believed the Allies owed him. His attitude would frustrate and anger his Western partners, would create tensions that would persist long after the war ended. But it would also drive the Allies to maintain the convoys despite the losses, to keep sending supplies despite the lack of appreciation, because they understood what Stalin would never publicly admit, that without those supplies, the Soviet Union might fall, and if the Soviet Union fell, the war against Nazi Germany would become immeasurably harder. The story of what Stalin said when he saw America's first huge convoy arrive is ultimately a story about the nature of the wartime alliance, about the gap between public propaganda and private calculation, about gratitude withheld and debts unacknowledged. It's a story about supplies delivered at enormous cost to an ally who would never say thank you, at least not while the war was being fought. Stalin's reaction to PQ-16's arrival was not the grateful acknowledgement the convoy crews might have hoped for. It was simply a nod, a notation of cargo received, and a demand for the next convoy to arrive sooner and carry more. That was the reality of the alliance with Stalin's Soviet Union. The convoys would continue because they had to, because the strategic necessity of keeping the Soviet Union in the war outweighed any desire for gratitude or acknowledgement. The sailors would keep sailing, the supplies would keep flowing, and Stalin would keep demanding more right up until the day the war ended and the alliance began to fracture into the Cold War that would define the next half-century.